The perfect critic. Érigé en loi ses impressions personnelles, c'est le grand effort d'un homme s'il est sincère. Lettre à Amazon. Coleridge was perhaps the greatest of English critics, and in a sense the last. After Coleridge we have Matthew Arnold, but Arnold, I think it will be conceded, was rather a propagandist for criticism than a critic, a popularizer rather than a creator of ideas. So long as this island remains an island, and we are no nearer the continent than were Arnold's contemporaries, the work of Arnold will be important. It is still a bridge across the channel, and it will always have been good sense. Since Arnold's attempt to correct his countrymen, English criticism has followed two directions. When a distinguished critic observed recently in a newspaper article that poetry is the most highly organized form of intellectual activity, we were conscious that we were reading neither Coleridge nor Arnold. Nor only have the words organized and activity occurring together in the phrase, that familiar vague suggestion of the scientific vocabulary which is characteristic of modern writing, but one asks questions which Coleridge and Arnold would not have permitted one to ask. How is it, for instance, that poetry is more highly organized than astronomy, physics, or pure mathematics, which we imagine to be, in relation to the scientist who practices them, intellectual activity of a pretty highly organized type? Mere strings of words, our critic continues with felicity and truth, flung like dabs of paint across a blank canvas, may awaken surprise, but have no significance whatever in the history of literature. The phrases by which Arnold is best known may be inadequate. They may assemble more doubts than they dispel, but they usually have some meaning. And if a phrase like the most highly organized form of intellectual activity is the highest organization of thought of which contemporary criticism, in a distinguished representative, is capable, then we conclude modern criticism is degenerate. The verbal disease above noticed may be reserved for diagnosis by and by. It is not a disease from which Mr. Arthur Symons, for the quotation was, of course, not from Mr. Symons, notably suffers. Mr. Symons represents the other tendency. He is a representative of what is always called aesthetic criticism, or impressionable criticism, and it is this form of criticism which I propose to examine at once. Mr. Symons, the critical successor of Pater, and partly of Swinburne, I fancy that the phrase sick or sorry is the common property of all three, is the impressionistic critic. He, if anyone, would be said to expose a sensitive and cultivated mind. Cultivated, that is, by the accumulation of a considerable variety of impressions from all the arts and several languages, before an object. And his criticism, if anyone's, would be said to exhibit to us, like the plate, the faithful record of the impressions, more numerous or more refined than our own, upon a mind more sensitive than our own. A record, we observe, which is also an interpretation, a translation, for it must itself impose impressions upon us, and these impressions are as much created as transmitted by this criticism. I do not say at once that this is Mr. Symons, but it is the impressionistic critic, and the impressionistic critic is supposed to be Mr. Symons. At hand is a volume which we may test, Studies in Elizabethan Drama. 10 of these 13 essays deal with single plays of Shakespeare, and it is therefore fair to take one of these 10 as a specimen of the book. Antony and Cleopatra is the most wonderful, I think, of all Shakespeare's plays, and Mr. Symons reflects that Cleopatra is the most wonderful of all women. The queen who ends the dynasty of the Ptolemites has been the star of poets, a malign star shedding baleful light, from Horace and Propertius down to Victor Hugo, and it is not to poets only. What, we ask, is this for? As a page on Cleopatra and on her possible origin in the Dark Lady of the Sonnets unfolds itself, and we find, gradually, that this is not an essay on a work of art or a work of intellect, but that Mr. Symons is living through the play as one might live it through in the theatre. recounting, commenting. In her last days, Cleopatra touches a certain elevation. She would die 1,000 times rather than live to be a mockery and a scorn in men's mouths. She is a woman to the last. So she dies. The play ends with a touch of grave pity. Presented in this rather unfair way, torn apart like the leaves of an artichoke, the impressions of Mr. Symons come to resemble a common type of popular literary lecture, in which the stories of plays or novels are retold, the motives of the characters set forth, and the work of art therefore made easier for the beginner. But this is not Mr. Symons' reason for writing. The reason why we find a similarity between his essay and this form of education is that Antony and Cleopatra is a play with which we are pretty well acquainted, and of which we have, therefore, our own impressions. We can please ourselves with our own impressions of the characters and their emotions, and we do not find the impressions of another person, however sensitive, very significant. But if we can recall the time when we were ignorant of the French symbolists, and met with the symbolist movement in literature, we remember that book as an introduction to wholly new feelings, as a revelation. After we have read Verlaine and Laforgue and Rimbaud and returned to Mr. Symons' book, we may find that our own impressions dissent from his. The book has not, perhaps, a permanent value for the one reader, but it has led to results of permanent importance for him. The question is not whether Mr. Symons' impressions are true or false. So far as you can isolate the impression, the pure feeling, it is, of course, neither true nor false. The point is that you never rest at the pure feeling. You react in one of two ways, or, as I believe Mr. Symons does, in a mixture of the two ways. The moment you try to put the impressions into words, you either begin to analyze and construct, to ériger en loi, or you begin to create something new. It is significant that Swinburne, by whose poetry Mr. Symons may at one time have been influenced, is one man in his poetry and a different man in his criticism. To this extent, and in this respect only, that he is satisfying a different impulse. He is criticizing, expounding, arranging. You may say this is not the criticism of a critic, that it is emotional, not intellectual, though of this there are two opinions, but it is in the direction of analysis and construction, a beginning to ériger en loi, and not in the direction of creation. So I infer that Swinburne found an adequate outlet for the creative impulse in his poetry, and none of it was forced back and out through his critical prose. The style of the latter is essentially a prose style, and Mr. Symons' prose is much more like Swinburne's poetry than it is like his prose. I imagine, though here one's thought is moving in almost complete darkness, that Mr. Symons is far more disturbed, far more profoundly affected by his reading than was Swinburne, who responded rather by a violent and immediate and comprehensive burst of admiration, which may have left him internally unchanged. The disturbance in Mr. Symons is almost, but not quite, to the point of creating. The reading sometimes fecundates his emotions to produce something new, which is not criticism, but is not the expulsion, the ejection, the birth of creativeness. The type is not uncommon, although Mr. Symons is far superior to most of the type. Some writers are essentially of the type that react in excess of the stimulus, making something new out of the impressions, but suffer from a defect of vitality or an obscure obstruction, which prevents nature from taking its course. Their sensibility alters the object, but never transforms it. Their reaction is that of the ordinary emotional person, developed to an exceptional degree. For this ordinary emotional person, experiencing a work of art has a mixed critical and creative reaction. It is made up of comment and opinion, and also new emotions, which are vaguely applied to his own life. The sentimental person, in whom a work of art arouses all sorts of emotions, which have nothing to do with that work of art whatever, but are accidents of personal association, is an incomplete artist. For in an artist, these suggestions made by a work of art, which are purely personal, become fused with a multitude of other suggestions from multitudinous experience, and result in the production of a new object which is no longer purely personal, because it is a work of art itself. It would be rash to speculate, and is perhaps impossible to determine, what is unfulfilled in Mr. Symons' charming verse, that overflows into his critical prose. Certainly we may say that in Swinburne's verse, the circuit of impression and expression is complete, and Swinburne was therefore able, in his criticism, to be more a critic than Mr. Symons. This gives us an intimation why the artist is, each within his own limitations, oftenest to be depended on as a critic. His criticism will be criticism, and not the satisfaction of a suppressed creative wish, which, in most other persons, is apt to interfere fatally. Before considering what the proper critical reaction of artistic sensibility is, how far criticism is feeling and how far thought, and what sort of thought is permitted, it may be instructive to prod a little into that other temperament, so different from Mr. Symons, which issues in generalities such as that quoted near the beginning of this article. 2. L'écrivain de style abstrait est presque toujours un sentimental, de moins un sensitif. L'écrivain artiste n'est presque jamais un sentimental et très rarement un sensitif. Le problème du style. The statement already quoted, that poetry is the most highly organized form of intellectual activity, may be taken as a specimen of the abstract style in criticism. The confused distinction which exists in most heads between abstract and concrete is due not so much to a manifest fact of the existence of two types of mind, an abstract and a concrete, as to the existence of another type of mind, the verbal or philosophic. I, of course, do not imply any general condemnation of philosophy. I am, for the moment, using the word philosophic to cover the unscientific ingredients of philosophy, to cover, in fact, the greater part of the philosophic output of the last 100 years. There are two ways in which a word may be abstract. It may have, the word activity, for example, a meaning which cannot be grasped by appeal to any of the senses. Its apprehension may require deliberate suppression of analogies of visual or muscular experience, which is nonetheless an effort of imagination. Activity will mean for the trained scientist, if he employed the term, either nothing at all, or something still more exact than anything it suggests to us. If we are allowed to accept certain remarks of Pascal and Mr. Bertrand Russell about mathematics, we believe that the mathematician deals with objects, if he will permit us to call them objects, which directly affect his sensibility. And during a good part of history, the philosopher endeavored to deal with objects which he believed to be of the same exactness as the mathematicians. Finally, Hegel arrived, and if not perhaps the first, he was certainly the most prodigious exponent of emotional systematization, dealing with his emotions as if they were definite objects which had aroused those emotions. His followers have, as a rule, taken for granted that words have definite meanings, overlooking the tendency of words to become indefinite emotions. No one who had not witnessed the event could imagine the conviction in the tone of Professor Eucken as he pounded the table and exclaimed, "Was ist Geist? Geist ist." If verbalism were confined to professional philosophers, no harm would be done, but their corruption has extended very far. Compare a medieval theologian or mystic, compare a 17th century preacher, with any liberal sermon since Schleiermacher, and you will observe that words have changed their meanings. What they have lost is definite, and what they have gained is indefinite. The vast accumulations of knowledge, or at least of information, deposited by the 19th century have been responsible for an equally vast ignorance. When there is so much to be known, when there are so many fields of knowledge in which the same words are used with different meanings, when everyone knows a little about a great many things, it becomes increasingly difficult for anyone to know whether he knows what he is talking about or not. And when we do not know, or when we do not know enough, we tend always to substitute emotions for thoughts. The sentence so frequently quoted in this essay will serve for an example of this process as well as any, and may be profitably contrasted with the opening phrases of the posterior analytics. Not only all knowledge, but all feeling, is in perception. The inventor of poetry as the most highly organized form of intellectual activity was not engaged in perceiving when he composed this definition. He had nothing to be aware of except his own emotion about poetry. He was, in fact, absorbed in a very different activity, not only from that of Mr. Symons, but from that of Aristotle. Aristotle is a person who has suffered from the adherence of persons who must be regarded less as his disciples than as his sectaries. One must be firmly distrustful of accepting Aristotle in a canonical spirit. This is to lose the whole living force of him. He was primarily a man of not only remarkable, but universal intelligence, and universal intelligence means that he could apply his intelligence to anything. The ordinary intelligence is good only for certain classes of objects. A brilliant man of science, if he is interested in poetry at all, may conceive grotesque judgments. Like one poet because he reminds him of himself, or another because he expresses emotions which he admires. He may use art, in fact, as the outlet for the egotism which is suppressed in his own speciality. But Aristotle had none of these impure desires to satisfy. In whatever sphere of interest, he looked solely and steadfastly at the object. In his short and broken treatise, he provides an eternal example, not of laws or even of method, for there is no method except to be very intelligent, but of intelligence itself swiftly operating the analysis of sensation to the point of principle and definition. It is far less Aristotle than Horace who has been the model for criticism up to the 19th century. A precept, such as Horace or Boileau gives us, is merely an unfinished analysis. It appears as a law, a rule, because it does not appear in its most general form. It is empirical. When we understand necessity as Spinoza knew, we were free because we assent. The dogmatic critic who lays down a rule, who affirms a value, has left his labor incomplete. Such statements may often be justifiable as a saving of time, but in matters of great importance the critic must not coerce, and he must not make judgments of worse and better. He must simply elucidate. The reader will form the correct judgment for himself. And again, the purely technical critic, the critic, that is, who writes to expound some novelty or impart some lesson to practitioners of an art, can be called a critic only in a narrow sense. He may be analyzing perceptions and the means for arousing perceptions, but his aim is limited and is not the disinterested exercise of intelligence. The narrowness of the aim makes easier the detection of the merit or feebleness of the work. Even of these writers there are very few, so that their criticism is of great importance within its limits. So much suffices for Campion. Dryden is far more disinterested. He displays much free intelligence. And yet even Dryden, or any literary critic of the 17th century, is not quite a free mind. Compare it, for instance, with such a mind as Rochefoucauld. There is always a tendency to legislate rather than to inquire, to devise accepted laws, even to overturn, but to reconstruct out of the same material. And the free intelligence is that which is wholly devoted to inquiry. Coleridge, again, whose natural abilities, and some of whose performances are probably more remarkable than those of any other modern critic, cannot be estimated as an intelligence completely free. The nature of the restraint in his case is quite different from that which limited the 17th century critics, and is much more personal. Coleridge's metaphysical interest was quite genuine, and was, like most metaphysical interest, an affair of his emotions. But a literary critic should have no emotions except those immediately provoked by a work of art, and these, as I've already hinted, are, when valid, perhaps not to be called emotions at all. Coleridge is apt to take leave of the data of criticism, and arouse the suspicion that he has been diverted into a metaphysical hare and hounds. His end does not always appear to be the return to the work of art, with improved perception and intensified, because more conscious enjoyment. His center of interest changes. His feelings are impure. In the derogatory sense, he is more philosophic than Aristotle. For everything that Aristotle says illuminates the literature which is the occasion for saying it. But Coleridge only now and then. It is one more instance of the pernicious effect of emotion. Aristotle had what is called the scientific mind, a mind which, as it is rarely found among scientists except in fragments, might better be called the intelligent mind. For there is no other intelligence than this, and so far as artists and men of letters are intelligent, we may doubt whether the level of intelligence among men of letters is as high as among men of science. Their intelligence is of this kind. Sainte-Beuve was a physiologist by training, but it is probable that his mind, like that of the ordinary scientific specialist, was limited in its interests, and that this was not primarily an interest in art. If he was a critic, there is no doubt that he was a very good one, but we may conclude that he earned some other name. Of all modern critics, perhaps Remy de Gourmont had most of the general intelligence of Aristotle. An amateur, though an excessively able amateur, in physiology, he combined to a remarkable degree sensitiveness, erudition, sense of fact, and sense of history, and generalizing power. We assume the gift of a superior sensibility, and for sensibility, wide and profound reading does not mean merely a more extended pasture. There is not merely an increase of understanding, leaving the original acute impression unchanged. The new impressions modify the impressions received from the objects already known. An impression needs to be constantly refreshed by new impressions in order that it may persist at all. It needs to take its place in a system of impressions, and this system tends to become articulate in a generalized statement of literary beauty. There are, for instance, many scattered lines and tercets in the Divine Comedy, which are capable of transporting even a quite uninitiated reader, just sufficiently acquainted with the roots of the language to decipher the meaning, to an impression of overpowering beauty. This impression may be so deep that no subsequent study and understanding will intensify it, but at this point the impression is emotional. The reader, in the ignorance which we postulate, is unable to distinguish the poetry from an emotional state aroused in himself by the poetry, a state which may be merely an indulgence of his own emotions. The poetry may be an accidental stimulus. The end of the enjoyment of poetry is a pure contemplation from which all the accidents of personal emotion are removed. Thus we aim to see the object as it really is, and find a meaning for the words of Arnold. And without a labor which is largely a labor of the intelligence, we are unable to attain that stage of vision, amor intellectualis Dei. Such considerations, cast in this general form, may appear commonplaces, but I believe that it is always opportune to call attention to the torpid superstition that appreciation is one thing, and intellectual criticism something else. Appreciation in popular psychology is one faculty, and criticism another, an arid cleverness building theoretical scaffolds upon one's own perceptions or those of others. On the contrary, the true generalization is not something superposed upon an accumulation of perceptions. The perceptions do not, in a really appreciative mind, accumulate as a mass, but form themselves as a structure, and criticism is the statement in language of this structure. It is a development of sensibility. The bad criticism, on the other hand, is that which is nothing but an expression of emotion, and emotional people, such as stockbrokers, politicians, men of science, and a few people who pride themselves on being unemotional, detest or applaud great writers such as Spinoza or Stendhal because of their frigidity. The writer of the present essay once committed himself to the statement that the poetic critic is criticizing poetry in order to create poetry. He is now inclined to believe that the historical and the philosophical critics had better be called historians and philosophers quite simply. As for the rest, there are merely various degrees of intelligence. It is fatuous to say that criticism is for the sake of creation, or creation for the sake of criticism. It is also fatuous to assume that there are ages of criticism and ages of creativeness, as if by plunging ourselves into intellectual darkness we were in better hopes of finding spiritual light. The two directions of sensibility are complementary, and as sensibility is rare, unpopular, and desirable, it is to be expected that the critic and the creative artist should frequently be the same person.